At our family Christmas dinner, I was told, "You can eat in the car." My brother smirked. Why would we waste a seat? I stood there, holding the dessert I made from scratch, still hoping they'd see me. That moment didn't break me. It clarified everything I had refused to believe for years. My name is Kate Capshaw. I'm 42 years old, and for the last 16 years, I've worked in human resources at a private hospital network in Atlanta. Yes. I started as a case manager with no title and no desk, worked nights and weekends, took classes to get my SHRM certification, and slowly climbed until I became director of HR for 3 full locations. People came to me when they were at their worst, doctors accused of misconduct, nurses burned out to the edge of collapse, staff trying to hold on after losing patience and purpose. My job wasn't glamorous, but it was real. I fixed systems, I held people accountable, and I did it quietly. That's how I've lived most of my life, quietly, until that night. I grew up in Marietta, Georgia, in a 2-story colonial with black shutters and a maple tree in the front yard. My mother, Judith, was a high school English teacher, obsessed with appearances and grammar. My father, Robert, was a mechanical engineer, good with silence and lawn care. Then there was Brian, my older brother, by 2 years, who walked through life like it owed him something and usually collected. By the time we were in high school, it was clear Brian was the family's favorite. He got away with skipping curfews, slamming doors, wrecking our father's old Buick. I got grounded for eye rolling or being too sensitive. When I was 20, I left Georgia for a year to intern in New York. It was a bold move for me. I remember the night I told my mother how she folded laundry with exaggerated care and said, "I guess not everyone's meant to stay close to home." When I came back, she didn't ask what I'd learned. She asked why I hadn't called more often. I should have known then that proximity, not progress, was what they valued. But part of me never stopped hoping that if I worked hard enough, achieved enough, they'd see me as worthy. This Christmas felt important. I hadn't missed a family holiday in 20 years, even though they'd given me every reason to stop showing up. The year before, I was asked to sleep on an air mattress while Brian and his wife Olivia took the guest room. The year before that, they forgot I was vegetarian and served ham. This year, I wanted things to be different. I brought gifts that actually meant something. For Dad, a framed map of the bridges he used to design. For Mom, a scarf in the shade she always said complimented her eyes. For Brian, a vintage pocket watch I found at an estate sale, similar to one he'd broken as a teenager. I even baked something, which I never do. A cranberry almond tart with orange zest crust. I wanted them to know I'd made an effort. I wanted to be seen. The house was already full when I arrived. Laughter poured from the living room, and Christmas music played at just the right volume to drown out awkward silences. Olivia was telling a story about their recent ski trip to Aspen, and everyone nodded and smiled like she was royalty. I stood in the doorway holding a tray of still warm tart, waiting for someone to say hello. My mother walked past me, glanced at the tart, and said, "Oh, good, dessert." That was it. I placed the tart on the buffet table and slipped off my coat. Daddy. Dad gave me a half hug and asked how traffic was. Brian didn't look up from his glass of wine. Olivia smiled in that polite way she always does, like she's waiting for the conversation to turn back to her. I joined the flow of people, pretending not to notice how no one asked about work, or life, or anything. So I made small talk with my cousin Elise, who complimented my dress and then asked how Brian's new office renovation was going. I nodded and swallowed the sourness building in my chest. This was the game. Play it right, and you get to stay invisible. Play it wrong, and you're the problem child. Dinner was called at 5 sharp. The table was already set. 10 places. I counted. 10 plates. 10 name cards. I stood behind one of the chairs, scanning again. No card said Kate. I checked the ends of the table, the kids' table. Nothing. My mother walked in behind me and said, "Oh, Kate, we weren't sure you'd be coming, so we didn't set a spot." I blinked. "But I confirmed last week." She smiled like that made it worse. "Well, there just isn't space this year. You can fix a plate and eat in the sunroom, or the car if you'd rather." That's when Brian chimed in from across the room. "Why would we waste a seat?" he said, not even bothering to make it sound like a joke. He sipped his wine, smirked. My heart beat louder than the music. Around me, no one spoke. No one looked directly at me. Not Dad, not Olivia, not even Elise, who once confided that she thought Brian was a bit much. I stood there holding my breath, waiting for someone to correct the mistake, to say it wasn't intentional, but no one did, and that silence was the loudest truth I'd ever heard. And that night, I sat in my car, parked just 2 blocks away, engine off, hands frozen on the steering wheel. The cranberry almond tart sat untouched on the passenger seat. I watched the lights in the living room flicker behind the curtains, listened to the muffled echo of silverware on porcelain. I felt hollow, and yet, underneath that emptiness, something else was rising, something older than anger, older than sadness, something that had been waiting years to be named, the beginning of enough. I didn't drive home that night. I checked into a small hotel near the highway, the kind with beige carpeting and a coffee machine that sputtered but never brewed anything hot. I didn't want anyone to see me walk through the door of my own apartment, looking like that pie on the passenger seat. Lipstick faded, heart wrung dry. I lay on the stiff mattress, fully dressed, eyes wide open, and thought about all the times I had ignored the signs, the passive-aggressive remarks, the gifts I gave that were never used, the way Brian always got the last word, even if it was cruel, and no one ever held him accountable. I used to think families were supposed to be complicated. Now I realize mine wasn't complicated. It was engineered. Growing up, Brian was the center of gravity in our house. Everything revolved around him. If he got a B on a test, the teacher had been unfair. If I got an A, it was expected. He punched a hole in the hallway wall when he was 17 and called it teenage frustration. When I cried quietly in my room after being dumped at prom, my mother knocked once and said, "Some people just don't have thick skin." At the time, I internalized it. I thought maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe I needed to earn love by being easier, quieter, more productive. So I overcompensated. I stayed out of trouble. I made honor roll every year. I skipped parties to babysit for free. I thought if I followed all the unspoken rules, I'd eventually be treated like I mattered. That illusion lasted longer than I cared to admit. Even in my late 20s, after I bought my own condo and had my name on business cards, I'd still make the 2-hour drive home with homemade gifts and the need to be seen. But nothing ever changed. Brian would get praised for buying Dad a watch he probably expense wrote through work. I'd get a lukewarm, "How thoughtful," for the rare historical photo I tracked down of Dad's college campus. It wasn't about the gifts. It was about the pattern, the undercurrent, the hierarchy that was never stated but always enforced. In this family, Brian was the sun, and I was the satellite that better not drift too far or shine too bright. The next morning, after Christmas, I sat by the window of my hotel room, sipping lukewarm coffee and staring at the gray sky. I remembered something Dr. Sir Lynette Ross had once told me in therapy years ago during a session I only half believed in. She said, "When you're constantly denied emotional oxygen, eventually silence feels like safety." At the time, I nodded politely and forgot the quote by the time I got to my car. But now, those words came back like thunder. I had mistaken silence for peace, endurance for strength. I wasn't strong for staying in this family dynamic. I was just surviving it. Oh. That realization was both painful and freeing. For the first time, I let myself replay the years as they were, not as I had hoped them to be. When I got my first real promotion at 29, I called home to share the news. Mom told me it was nice, but quickly changed the subject to Brian's new boat. When I was published in a medical HR journal for a case study I led, she never mentioned it, even when I mailed her the magazine. Meanwhile, when Brian opened a new office branch, they threw him a backyard party with printed banners. When I asked Olivia once, just once, why she never stood up for me, she looked uncomfortable and said, "I just try to keep the peace." That's what everyone in the family said, keeping the peace, as if that peace didn't come at the cost of my dignity. But last night was the moment it all broke through, not because of the missing place card, not even because of Brian's insult. It was the silence, the quiet complicity of people who had watched this unfold for decades and never said a word. The father who always had an excuse, the mother who buried truth under civility, the cousins who laughed at Brian's cruel jokes, then texted me later with "you, okay?" The kind of exclusion that doesn't shout but suffocates. And I had let it. I saw I had accepted scraps of kindness and convinced myself they were meals. That morning, I didn't call anyone. I didn't send a passive-aggressive thank you text. I didn't reply to the voicemail from my mother that began with "sorry about the mix-up" and ended with "you know how sensitive you can be." I packed my things, checked out, and drove back to Atlanta in complete silence, save for the turn signals and occasional breath. When I reached my apartment, I took the tart out of the car and placed it in the fridge, untouched. I showered, not to erase the night, but to mark the start of something different. Then I opened my laptop and scheduled an appointment with Dr. Ross for the following Tuesday. I hadn't seen her in over a year, but I needed to go back, not to fix myself, but to understand why I had been trying so hard to be accepted by people who were never interested in seeing me whole. That same afternoon, I sat at my kitchen table and wrote down a list, not a list of resolutions, a list of moments, specific memories where I had chosen silence over confrontation, moments where I should have said, "that was unkind," or "I deserve better," but instead I swallowed it. I called it the inventory. It included the time Mom told Olivia, in front of me, "You're like the daughter I always wanted." The time Brian joked that I was just bitter because HR doesn't make real money. The time I was left off the family group vacation invite and was told afterward, "We figured you'd be too busy anyway." Each memory had a date, a place, a name. It wasn't about keeping score. It was about facing what I'd normalized. By the time the sun set, I had filled 3 pages. I read them slowly, then folded them up and placed them inside an envelope labeled "No More Excuses." I didn't know what I would do with it yet, but I knew I needed it to exist. Because that envelope didn't just hold painful memories. It held evidence that I hadn't imagined it, that it wasn't in my head, that emotional abuse doesn't always come with shouting or bruises. Sometimes it looks like being the only one not invited to the photo. Sometimes it sounds like silence when you need defense. Sometimes it's the empty chair that was never really meant for you. That night, I fell asleep without replaying the scene in the kitchen for the 100th time. I didn't wonder if I should have spoken up, or if maybe they were right to exclude me. For the first time in years, I didn't need their version of the story. I was beginning to believe mine. The Tuesday after Christmas, I sat in the waiting room of Dr. Lynette Ross's practice, the same beige chair I hadn't touched in over a year. The magazines on the side table were still out of date, and the soft instrumental music still made me feel like I was being prepared for surgery rather than therapy. I had almost canceled that morning. Some part of me still wanted to pretend I could shake it off, that it wasn't as deep as it felt. But another part, older, quieter, sharper, knew this wasn't just a bad Christmas. It was the final straw in a lifetime of invisible injuries, and I needed help stitching them closed. And Dr. Ross opened the door right on time. She looked exactly the same: silver curls, soft gray sweater, eyes that didn't blink when you said hard things. She motioned me in without comment, and I sat across from her on the blue couch, hands clasped. We started the way we always had, with small talk. How was work? How was my sleep? But it wasn't long before I said it. They didn't set a place for me at Christmas dinner. My brother said it would be a waste. She didn't flinch, just nodded. What did you feel in that moment? I paused. I felt expected, like some part of me always knew it would come to this, like I'd been rehearsing for that exclusion my whole life. She asked about the other guests, if anyone had stepped in. I said no. She asked what I did. I told her I left. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't make a scene. I just walked away. She leaned forward slightly. Why do you think that moment hit differently than the others? I stared at the floor for a long time before answering, because this time, I didn't explain it away. I didn't try to fix it. I didn't think maybe I misheard, or maybe they were just tired. I saw it clearly, and I didn't flinch. Dr. Ross nodded slowly. That kind of clarity can be disorienting, but it's also where healing starts. I had heard that word before, healing, but it always sounded abstract, like something that happened in books or on podcasts. Now it felt physical. I wasn't trying to heal to win them over. I was trying to stop bleeding internally from wounds I hadn't even admitted were there. That week, I did something I hadn't done in years. I took 3 days off work without checking email. I didn't respond to Olivia's vague text, asking if everything was okay. I didn't call my mom back when she left a message suggesting we clear the air. Instead, I started writing, not a revenge letter, not a dramatic goodbye, just memories, little ones. The time I spent my birthday alone at age 15 because Brian got caught drinking and the whole family couldn't deal with another thing. The time I was praised at work, and when I told my mom, she said, "That's nice, but do you think they're just overcorrecting for diversity?" Each memory I wrote came with a question, not, "Why did they do this?" but "Why did I accept it?" The answers weren't pretty, because I thought being the good daughter meant swallowing hurt, because I thought being successful would earn their pride, because I thought loyalty required silence, but mostly because I wanted to believe that if I kept showing up, they'd eventually meet me halfway. By New Year's, I had filled half a journal. Dr. Ross encouraged me to keep writing. She said patterns often don't make sense until they're on paper. And she was right. Once I saw them lined up, year after year, holiday after holiday, it became impossible to pretend this was accidental. This was a system, a quiet, generational system built on favoritism, guilt, and unspoken contracts. Brian was allowed to be cruel because he was charismatic. I was expected to absorb it because I was strong. Mom justified his behavior because she feared emotional honesty. Dad avoided conflict because he didn't know how to handle women in pain. I began revisiting old conversations in my head with new filters, not to punish myself, but to understand. Like when I brought my college boyfriend home, and Brian joked he wouldn't last long because Kate has control issues. I had laughed it off. So had everyone else. But that boyfriend broke up with me 2 weeks later, citing that very phrase. Or the time I invited my parents to a work gala where I was being honored and they declined because Brian had a weekend golf tournament. I hadn't allowed myself to be angry. I had told myself they were just busy. I had edited my memories to keep the narrative livable. Now I was unediting. One of the most pivotal moments came during a session in mid-January. Dr. Ross asked me, gently, what would it mean if they never changed? I felt my throat tighten. You mean, if they never apologized? She nodded. Yes, if this version of your family is all there ever is. I sat with that question for a long time. The answer came slowly, like cold water soaking through cotton. It would mean I have to stop hoping and start grieving. She said nothing, just waited, and I cried. Not loud, not broken, just steady, relieved tears, because naming the grief was permission to stop pretending. I wasn't mourning the loss of a perfect family. I was mourning the myth that I ever had one. That same week, I reopened an old email from Marianne Blake, a colleague I hadn't spoken to in months. She had left the hospital system after being sidelined in a promotion that she clearly deserved. I had comforted her back then, but secretly feared I'd be next. In her email, she had invited me to coffee to talk about something new. I replied and set the date. When we met at a quiet cafe downtown, she was radiant, relaxed, focused. She told me she had started a boutique consulting firm for healthcare leadership, specializing in rebuilding HR infrastructure after crisis. She said she needed someone who could handle complicated people with quiet strength. Kate, that's you, she said, with a clarity I hadn't heard in a long time. You're the person who people overlook until they realize they needed you all along. I didn't commit that day, but something stirred. For the first time, someone saw value in what I had always been told was invisible. My ability to stay calm, to see through manipulation, to read silences like pages in a book. It didn't feel like escape. It felt like alignment. When I told Dr. Ross about the offer, she smiled. There's power in rebuilding from the outside, she said, especially when the inside has proven it won't hold you. That line stayed with me. Not everything broken has to be fixed from within. Some things are better rebuilt elsewhere, with different people, under a sky that feels your own. And maybe, just maybe, the family I was meant to belong to wasn't the one I was born into. It was the one I could choose to build, on truth, on respect, on mutual recognition, and I was starting to believe that was possible. By the first week of February, I had made my decision. I typed out my resignation letter in a quiet office just after 7 p.m., long after the hallways had emptied, and only the soft hum of climate control kept the space from falling completely silent. The screen glowed in front of me as I reread every line, careful not to sound bitter, not to give them anything to spin into a story of instability. I knew how corporate HR operated. I had been part of that machinery for years. If I left too emotionally, they'd say I was burnt out. If I stayed too long, I'd become complicit. So I wrote with clarity. I thanked them for the opportunity. I cited personal alignment and the pursuit of values-led work. Then I clicked send. It was the first time in years I had acted entirely for myself, without seeking approval, permission, or applause. The next day, I cleared out my office before anyone arrived. I packed my framed degrees, the ceramic mug I always kept paperclips in, and the small photo of me with my dog, Riley, who had passed away 2 winters ago. As I shut the lights and pulled the door closed behind me, I felt no fear, just space, like a room had opened up inside me where something new could finally grow. Marianne and I met again later that week, this time at her new office, a converted warehouse in West Midtown, filled with natural light and mismatched furniture that somehow made it all feel intentional. She walked me through her firm's mission, helping hospitals and care systems rebuild broken internal culture after HR failures, lawsuits, or public scandals. We need someone who understands how to de-escalate chaos without losing clarity, she said, and someone who's been in the system long enough to speak both languages. I knew what she meant. The ability to translate emotional dysfunction into policy, the skill of identifying emotional abuse in workplaces that called it tough leadership. It wasn't just a job. It was a kind of truth-telling I had been doing for years under different names. Still, the first weeks were hard. There was no paycheck every other Friday, no IT department to fix my email. I set up a home office with secondhand furniture and a whiteboard. I mounted myself. I took meetings on Zoom in a blazer over pajamas. Some days, the doubt crept in, not about the decision, but about whether I was too late, whether I had spent too many years silencing myself to be heard now, whether the damage from the toxic family dynamic I'd grown up in had hollowed me out too much to rebuild anything stable. Then came the first call. A private clinic north of Atlanta had just fired its HR lead after a whistleblower leak revealed years of unchecked harassment claims. The clinic was a mess, morale at rock bottom, senior leadership panicking, staff threatening to unionize. Marianne had pitched our firm, and they had agreed to a trial project. She wanted me to take lead, and my hands trembled slightly when I signed the contract. It was more money than I had ever made in one project. But more than that, it was the first time someone said, out loud and without hesitation, "We trust your judgment." That trust did something. It peeled back a layer of self-protection I didn't even realize was still there. The work was brutal. The clinic's internal culture was a maze of unresolved grudges, power imbalances, and policy gaps that allowed for repeated harm. Staff didn't believe in any process. They had been failed too many times. I spent weeks conducting one-on-one interviews, listening without flinching as people described what they had endured. I didn't take notes in front of them. I didn't correct or coach. I just validated. Quietly, consistently, I let them see someone was finally paying attention. By the end of March, the tide began to shift. A junior nurse stopped me in the hallway and said, "This is the first time I've felt like staying." The director of operations, who had been skeptical at first, sent me an email titled simply, "I was wrong about you." I printed it and pinned it above my desk, not out of vanity, but to remind myself that people can change their minds when shown another way, even the ones who resist them. Throughout that time, I kept journaling. Every night, I added a new entry, not just about work, but about the small wins and self-respect, like saying no to my mother's text when she asked if I could just let things go and come to Easter brunch, like not explaining my absence when Brian sent a vague group message saying, "We're all meeting for Dad's birthday. Hope to see you there." I didn't reply. I didn't need to defend my silence. It was a full sentence. But something shifted again in April. During a project debrief, Marianne told me that the clinic had not only renewed the contract, but wanted to feature our work in their public statement. They wanted me to write the internal response letter, the one that would go out to every staff member. It would be signed by the board, and my name would be in the footnote as lead consultant. It wasn't about credit. It was about visibility. It was about finally being in a room, figuratively or otherwise, where I was no longer asked to shrink. And that night, after sending the draft, I sat on my balcony with a glass of wine and watched the city below shift from orange dusk to blue-gray night. I thought about the years I spent trying to earn a seat at a table that had been built to exclude me, not just the family table, but all the tables I had been taught to approach cautiously, waiting to be asked, terrified to take up too much space. And now, here I was, not demanding space, creating it. It wasn't a cinematic moment. No triumphant music played, no montage of vindication. It was quiet, but that quiet felt different. It wasn't the kind of silence I used to confuse with peace. It was the kind of stillness that follows a hard truth told and finally believed. The kind that comes after you stop waiting to be chosen and start choosing yourself. By early May, I had fully stepped into a life that looked nothing like the one I had before, and yet it felt more like mine than anything ever had. Woke up each morning, not dreading the meetings on my calendar. I answered emails without bracing myself for the passive-aggressive tone of a superior who used just circling back as a weapon. I made my own decisions, from which clients to take to what hours I worked. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't easy, but it was honest. And in a strange way, that honesty made me stronger than I'd ever been. I had built something that didn't require anyone's permission to exist. Around that time, I started hearing things about Brian, not through family. Of course, they would never break the wall of silence that had protected him for so long. But word had a way of getting around. Marianne mentioned during one of our check-ins that a financial advisory firm in Atlanta was under quiet investigation for client misrepresentation, and Brian's name had been floated in an internal review. She didn't say it with malice. She just raised an eyebrow and said, "You might want to stay out of the crossfire." I nodded. I had no intention of stepping into it. For once, I was content to let the chips fall without rushing in to clean up after someone else's mess. Still, I would be lying if I said it didn't stir something in me. Not joy, not revenge, just a cold recognition that sometimes the lies people build their identity on eventually start to buckle under their own weight. Bryce, Brian had always presented himself as the successful one, the one who had it all figured out. The house in the gated neighborhood, the 2 cars, the country club membership. But beneath that image was always something brittle. He needed control. He needed the narrative, and anyone who challenged it became the villain. I, Grichikira, had just happened to play that role most consistently. The first message from my mother came 2 weeks later. It wasn't about Brian. It never was. It was about a family barbecue. We're all getting together. Memorial Day weekend. She wrote, "Hope you can come." There was no acknowledgement of the last time we'd spoken. No apology. No mention of Christmas. Just a carefully crafted illusion that everything was normal. That we were still a family that gathered and laughed and posed for photos. I read the message twice and then archived it without responding. That same night, my father called. I didn't answer. He left a voicemail. I know things have been tense, he said, his voice lower than usual. Your mother's just trying to keep the family together. He paused. Brian's dealing with a few things right now. It'd mean a lot if you came by. Not for him, for your mother. That last line stung more than I expected. Even now, after everything, I was still being asked to show up not for myself, not even for reconciliation, but to protect the image of a family that had never protected me. I played that voicemail 3 times, not because I was considering saying yes, but because I wanted to understand what it was they still didn't see, or maybe what they refused to see. That their constant prioritizing of Brian's comfort over my dignity wasn't just painful, it was destructive, and it had cost us a real relationship. I brought the voicemail to my next session with Dr. Ross. She listened carefully and then asked me something I didn't expect. If this had come 2 years ago, would you have gone? I thought about it. Yes, I said. I would have baked something. I would have shown up smiling and tried not to make anyone uncomfortable. I would have laughed at Brian's stories and pretended not to notice the jabs. She nodded. So what's different now? I looked at her and answered without hesitation. Now I know that silence isn't strength, and showing up doesn't make you part of a family. It just makes you available to be used. I didn't go to the barbecue. I spent Memorial Day weekend at a cabin outside Asheville with a friend from my consultant network, a woman named Becca, who had once left a high-powered job at a hospital after realizing she'd become someone she didn't like. We grilled vegetables on the porch, drank cold beer, and talked about the kind of legacy we wanted to leave behind. Not in terms of money or titles, but in how we treated people. I used to think being respected meant being perfect, Becca said at one point. Now, I think it just means being consistent. I wrote that in my journal that night. By mid-June, the news about Brian broke more publicly. An online article surfaced with a vague headline about client irregularities and financial disclosures being reviewed. His firm issued a statement saying the matter was internal and under review. But those of us who'd lived around people like Brian knew what that meant. It meant something had cracked, and no one was rushing to cover for him anymore. And my mother didn't reach out after the article, but my cousin Elise did. She messaged me late one night I read the piece. I'm sorry for not speaking up before, for laughing when he made fun of you. I see things more clearly now. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was something, a glimmer of accountability in a sea of long-standing denial. I replied with 3 words. Thank you, Elise. I didn't take pleasure in Brian's unraveling, but I didn't shield myself from it either. I let the truth sit in the room. I let it be what it was. And for once, I wasn't the one being called difficult or dramatic. I was just watching, from a safe distance, as the system that had protected him for decades finally stopped working the way it used to. One night, in the quiet of my apartment, I took out the old envelope I had labeled "No More Excuses." I added one final page. I titled it "What I Didn't Say," and I wrote the things I had wanted to scream all those years. That I wasn't jealous, that I wasn't broken, that I wasn't too sensitive or too proud. I was just tired of being erased. And somewhere between the lines, I realized something important. I wasn't waiting for justice anymore. I wasn't hoping for an apology. I wasn't even interested in revenge. I was simply done explaining who I was to people committed to misunderstanding me. And that was Powers. By July, the air in Atlanta turned thick with heat, and the kind of silence that follows a shift too big to name out loud. Brian had gone quiet on social media, which for him was as close to a public confession as anything could be. The firm had issued a follow-up statement saying he was on an extended leave, and the family chat, the one I was no longer part of, had gone from overly curated photo threads to nothing at all. It felt like the entire structure that once held him up was sagging inward, too proud to collapse, but too fragile to keep pretending. And I didn't intervene. I didn't message. I didn't ask questions. I let the weight of his own actions carry him wherever they needed to take him. Instead, I focused on what I could build. My consulting work grew faster than I expected. By midsummer, I had 3 active clients, 2 pending contracts, and a speaking engagement at a regional healthcare ethics summit. Talked about systemic accountability, psychological safety, and the cost of ignoring silent suffering in organizations. I didn't mention my family, but everything I said had their fingerprints on it. The rooms I walked into were different now. People listened. They didn't interrupt or politely nod while glancing at my resume. They asked questions, they took notes, and when I spoke, I didn't soften my voice to sound agreeable. I had spent too many years doing that. Now, I spoke with the kind of quiet certainty that comes from surviving without becoming bitter. Still, one date hovered in the distance like a shadow on the calendar: Christmas. I didn't dread it. I didn't fear it. But I knew it was coming, and I knew I couldn't let it arrive without making a choice. Not a dramatic return, not an ambush, just something honest, something final. Because the truth was, I wasn't angry anymore. I was done. But done didn't mean passive. Done meant I would close the door with both hands and leave nothing unsaid. So I started preparing. It began with the box, a simple black gift box I bought from a stationery shop near Piedmont Park. Inside it, I placed everything they had ignored: photocopies of texts Brian had sent to other family members, twisting things I'd said out of context, screenshots of messages where he made jokes at my expense in group chats I wasn't part of, a printed article detailing the financial misconduct case that, while still unresolved, had enough teeth to silence the usual defenders. And then there was the letter. Not a monologue, not a guilt trip, just a letter, 4 paragraphs long, written in clean, even handwriting, folded neatly on top of the documents. In the letter, I didn't accuse, I didn't insult. I simply named I named the times I was made invisible. I I named the moments I watched them turn away. I named the silence. And at the end, I wrote one sentence I had practiced over and over. This is not a plea for apology, nor a hope for understanding. It is simply the truth, left here so that I can finally walk away without carrying the weight of your denial. That was it. No signature, no demand, just the truth, wrapped in tissue paper and tied with a navy ribbons. The second part of my preparation came during a dinner with Elise. We had started meeting once a month, not always to talk about family, but sometimes the topic found its way in. That night, over a plate of roasted salmon and a glass of crisp white wine, she said, "You know they still think you're just going through a phase." I smiled. "Let them." She paused. "You're not planning on coming back just to prove something, are you?" I shook my head. "I'm coming back once, not to be accepted, to finish the story properly." She looked at me like she was seeing someone new. "Just promise me you won't let them pull you back in." I didn't hesitate. "I'm not going there for closure. I'm going there with it already in hand. By November, I finalized my decision. I RSVP'd to the family Christmas dinner invitation my mother had sent, with the same forced politeness she always used when pretending nothing had happened. It would be lovely to have you, the card said in her thin, elegant handwriting. Dinner at 5. As always, no mention of last year, no seat apology, just an invitation wrapped in decades of performance. I replied with one sentence. I'll be there at 5, with something for the table. On the surface, everything seemed normal, but underneath, I had shifted. I wasn't walking into that house to reclaim a place. I wasn't looking to be heard. I had stopped hoping for the kind of redemption that requires other people to see you differently. I had already given that to myself. A week before Christmas, I had a final session with Dr. Ross. I brought the gift box with me. She asked if I felt nervous. I told her no. What I felt was stillness, not the quiet before a storm, but the quiet after surviving one. Then you're ready, she said. And remember, their reaction doesn't define the power of what you're offering. I nodded, because I understood now. What I was bringing to that house wasn't confrontation. It was truth. And sometimes, truth doesn't need a fight. It just needs to be placed gently on the table and left behind. The night before Christmas, I stood in my apartment, box wrapped, coat pressed, shoes lined by the door. I looked around at the home I had built without their approval, without their blueprint. The photos on the wall were mine. The books on the shelf were mine. The quiet humming of a life no longer apologizing for existing was mine. I touched the locket I had begun wearing again, my grandmother's, left to me despite the family's efforts to forget it. A small, silver reminder that lineage is complicated, but legacy can be reclaimed. I wasn't going back for war. I wasn't going back for reconciliation. I was going back for completion. And when I walked through that door, I wouldn't be the Kate who used to lower her voice, take the smaller seat, swallow the insult. I would be the woman who had finally made room for herself, even if it meant walking away from the very people who never could. I arrived at the house on Christmas Day at 4:58 p.m., parked the car slowly across the street, and sat with the engine off for 1 minute. The neighborhood looked exactly as it always had: manicured lawns, wreaths on every door, a kind of curated warmth that masked the cold just beneath. I could already hear laughter inside, a familiar blend of forced joy and carefully moderated tones, the kind of laughter that looks good in family photos, but always left a hollow echo when I used to replay it in my mind on the way home. I took a breath, picked up the box from the passenger seat, and walked toward the door. My steps were steady, not defiant, not hesitant, just certain. When I rang the bell, it was Olivia who answered. She blinked, surprised for only a moment, then stepped aside with a tight smile. "You made it," she said, as if this were some overdue favor. I nodded without answering and stepped inside. The warmth hit me first physically, from the fireplace and the oven working overtime, and emotionally, in the curated sense of tradition. Everything was exactly as it always had been. Same garland over the stair rail, same mismatched family stockings hanging too low, same scent of pine and honey-glazed ham. I walked straight to the dining room, placed the black box carefully at the center of the table, then took the seat at the far end, the same one I had always taken near the hallway, next to the buffet, not the head, not the center, but this time, it wasn't because I was trying to stay out of the way. It was because I didn't need to be anywhere else. I had brought my own clarity, and it didn't require proximity to their attention. People began to file in one by one. My mother froze when she saw me, but quickly rearranged her face into a neutral smile. Brian looked up from his phone, eyes narrowed slightly, as if trying to gauge whether this was a setup. I could feel the room calculating, but I said nothing. I didn't greet anyone with performative warmth. I didn't ask about jobs or kids or new hobbies. I just sat, present, unapologetic, and Dinner began the way it always did. My father cleared his throat, said grace, thanked everyone for being here. He didn't mention me by name, but his voice caught ever so slightly when he said, "Family." I noticed. So did Olivia, whose wine glass lingered longer than necessary at her lips. As plates were passed, conversations tried to resume their usual rhythm. Someone asked about vacation plans. Someone else brought up football. No one mentioned the article. No one asked where I'd been last year. And for the first time, I didn't find that erasure cruel. I found it predictable and irrelevant. Midway through dinner, Brian made a joke, one of those sharp ones that passed as wit, but always had a target. "Glad to see we're all playing nice this year," he said, looking down the table toward me. Even the prodigal daughters made time for us. The room went quiet for just a second too long. I didn't flinch. I didn't smile. I simply looked him in the eye and said, "Not playing anything, just here to finish something." Then I turned back to my plate. The silence after that was different. Not just awkward, a little afraid. After dessert, as people stood and began moving toward the living room, I reached forward, untied the ribbon on the box, and slid it gently across the table toward my mother. She blinked. "What's this?" I looked at her, my voice calm. "Something I've been carrying for a long time, but not anymore." She didn't open it. She didn't need to. The weight of it sat loud on the linen tablecloth. Brian leaned in slightly, but I stood before he could speak. "I'm not asking for anything," I said. "I'm not trying to ruin Christmas. This isn't revenge, it's release." And with that, I walked to the door. No dramatic exit, no slammed frames, just a woman leaving a room that no longer fit hers. In the car, I sat for a moment, letting my breath catch up to my body. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt clear. For the first time in years, there was no part of me still reaching toward that house, still aching to be seen, still wondering if maybe, if I just behaved better, I'd be welcomed the right way. That version of me had been laid to rest. What remained was the woman who had rewritten her role in the story, not the black sheep, not the angry daughter, just a person who told the truth, even when it was inconvenient, even when it was too late for applause. That night, I drove home without music, letting the quiet stretch across every mile. The skyline appeared in the distance, calm and indifferent, and I welcomed its neutrality. No one in the city knew what I had done. No one would ask for details, but I would sleep knowing I had given my story an ending, not a perfect one, not one that healed everything, but one that belonged to me. And sometimes, that's enough. The week after Christmas passed in a blur of silence, not the hostile kind, but the kind that follows something undeniable. No one messaged me. No one called to ask questions about the box or the letter, and I didn't expect them to. What I had left behind wasn't a bomb. It was a mirror, and people only look into mirrors when they're ready. I knew they weren't. Maybe they never would be, but for the first time, their refusal to look didn't shrink me. I went back to work the next day, like it was any other. My calendar was full, my projects moving forward. I onboarded a new client, a small nonprofit struggling to repair its fractured leadership team. I flew to Raleigh for a panel on emotional accountability in the workplace and spent an hour after the event speaking with a young HR director who said, "I didn't know you could say some of these things out loud and still keep your job." I smiled and told her, "Sometimes you don't keep the job, but you keep yourself, and that's the part worth fighting for." In early January, I received an email from Elise. Short, 2 lines. "Mom's been quiet since Christmas. Brian's in damage control mode. Just wanted you to know what you did made ripples." I read it twice and didn't reply immediately, not because I didn't care, but because I wanted to sit with it. The idea that truth, told calmly and without cruelty, could shift something even when no one admits it. That maybe, in some small way, honesty could make its own kind of noise. A few days later, I ran into someone unexpected. I was at a bookstore downtown, browsing the memoir section. When I heard someone say my name in that careful tone people use when they're not sure they're welcome, I turned, and there was Olivia, no makeup, winter coat draped over one arm, a paperback in her hand. We stared at each other for a second longer than felt natural. Then she spoke. I didn't read the whole letter, she said, but I read enough. I raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. She looked down, thumbed the corner of her book. I guess I always thought you were being dramatic, until I realized how much energy it takes to stay quiet all the time. That caught me off guard. She wasn't apologizing, not exactly, but she wasn't deflecting either. I nodded slowly. It takes a lot, I said, and it empties you, piece by piece. Olivia looked up. I don't know how to fix anything, she said, voice quiet, but I think you were right to stop trying. Then she left. No long goodbye, no forced invitation, just honesty, brief and unfinished, but still a kind of progress. Later that night, I sat on my balcony again, wrapped in the same wool blanket I'd had since grad school, and looked out at the city lights. I thought about how much time I had spent chasing a version of family that could love me in the way I needed, and how somewhere along the way I'd stopped begging for it. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel sad. I felt free, and freedom, I was learning, was quieter than I expected. It didn't arrive with applause. It settled in slowly, like peace you didn't know you were allowed to have. By the end of the month, something else changed. A former colleague from my corporate days reached out and asked if I'd consider running a workshop for their leadership team. We've realized our culture was built on silence and reward systems, she wrote, and your name came up more than once when we talked about who we wish we'd listened to sooner. I stared at that line for a long time, not out of bitterness, but because it made something very clear. You don't always need revenge. Sometimes, being remembered for your truth long after they erased you is more powerful than any confrontation. I said yes to the workshop, not out of pride, out of purpose. February came, then March. The holidays faded, and with them, the usual family updates stopped arriving. I didn't mind. I didn't even notice until one day I saw the unopened Christmas card still sitting in my desk drawer. I pulled it out, ran my fingers over the envelope, and then tore it in half gently, without anger, just as a way of saying, I'm not waiting anymore. That night, I journaled something simple. Closure doesn't come from them understanding. It comes from you no longer needing them to. I began to pour more time into the writing project I had postponed for years, a book, maybe, or a long essay series about emotional invisibility in high-functioning families. I didn't care if it ever got published. I just wanted to put it somewhere, to name the quiet traumas, to make space for people like me, who had been told their pain was inconvenient or exaggerated or just a bad attitude. One afternoon, after a speaking event, a young man came up to me and said, your story made me call my sister. We haven't spoken in years because I always took my parents' side. I didn't realize I'd made her feel so erased. I didn't say anything profound. I just placed my hand on his shoulder and said, it's never too late to choose differently. And maybe that was the point of all of it, not to win, not to be proven right, but to show, through the quiet choices we make, that it's possible to live a life untethered from those who refuse to see us, a life defined not by how they hurt us, but by what we built when they stopped looking. By spring, the rhythm of my life no longer carried the echo of what I'd left behind. It wasn't that I'd forgotten. It was that I'd finally stopped looking over my shoulder. Every choice I made now came from a place that wasn't tangled in proving anything. My calendar was full, but not overwhelming. I had clients who respected my time, colleagues who didn't weaponize politeness, and a network that grew not from manipulation, but mutual belief in the kind of integrity that outlasts applause. One morning in April, I woke up to an email from a journalist who had attended one of my talks. She said my name had come up in an internal conversation at a national outlet about women who had quietly redefined leadership after leaving toxic systems. Would you be open to being interviewed? She asked. Your story doesn't scream. It resonates. And in this climate, that matters more. I sat there for a moment, rereading that sentence. It resonated, not because it validated me, but because it named something I hadn't had language for. I had become someone people listened to, not because I was loud, but because I had lived through the silence and found my own voice anyways. I agreed to the interview, not because I wanted publicity, because I knew someone like me would be reading, someone still sitting in the back seat of a family gathering, wondering why her name never came up in stories about success, someone still trying to find a way out of the roles she didn't audition for, but was forced to perform. If I could help her feel seen, even for 5 minutes, it would be enough. When the article came out, it was titled The Quiet Comeback: How Women Like Kate Capshaw Are Rewriting the Rules of Belonging. It didn't focus on my family. It focused on what I'd built, how I'd rebuilt trust in myself after being sidelined, and how I was helping other professionals do the same. They quoted a line I'd said offhand during the interview. Sometimes the real revolution is walking away without slamming the door. That line made its way into a dozen reposts. I watched as strangers shared it, captioned it, reinterpreted it as their own quiet truths. A week later, I received a message from a woman named Carla, a teacher from Ohio. She wrote, "I just read your story. I cried at my desk. I thought I was broken for not being able to forgive my family. Now I understand I don't have to hold on to pain to prove I'm strong. Thank you for giving that permission." I stared at the screen for a long time. I didn't know Carla, but I knew her ache. I had lived it. And if my journey could pull someone else even 1 inch closer to their own clarity, then everything I'd endured had found its purpose. That same month, I launched a mentorship circle. I didn't call it a program. I didn't brand it with buzzwords. It was just a space virtual, once a week, where women who had been overlooked, erased, or used as scapegoats could talk without being corrected or minimized. No fix-it energy, no toxic positivity, just presence, listening, naming things aloud. It grew slowly, by word of mouth. By June, we had over 40 participants, each story different, but the undercurrent was the same: women exhausted by the cost of maintaining their silence. One night, during a session, a woman named Priya said, "I thought I had to heal in secret. That being wounded in public made me weak. But seeing how you turned your fracture into a bridge, it changed something in me." I didn't respond immediately. I let her words hang in the air, because they were more than a compliment. They were proof that quiet resistance can ripple further than noise ever could. As the months passed, I no longer measured progress by who finally saw my worth. I measured it by how little I needed their recognition to feel whole. I still heard from Elise occasionally. Short notes, updates. Once she wrote, "Mom finally asked me if I think you meant to hurt them." I told her no. I told her you meant to stop hurting yourself. That one stayed with me because it reminded me that growth isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's slow, whispered, almost imperceptible, but it counts. I never heard from Brian, and that was fine. I didn't need an apology from someone who built a reputation on never being wrong. His silence wasn't power anymore. It was absence, and mine was presence, the kind that didn't wait for permission or praise, just showed up, whole. There were moments I thought back to that Christmas dinner, the way the ribbon felt in my hand, the look in my mother's eyes, the way no one said a word when I left. It used to haunt me. Now, it centered me because I knew exactly who I had been in that room: the person who refused to perform grief for the comfort of others, the person who made peace by no longer asking to be included in a version of family that only had room for the conveniento. And in that clarity, I thrived. I still had bad days, still had moments where doubt curled around the edges, but now, those moments didn't break me. They passed like weather, and I no longer blamed myself for the storms I didn't cause. By the time autumn returned, I had stopped marking time by anniversaries of pain. No more counting how many months since the Christmas dinner. No more watching family holidays from a distance. What lingered now wasn't grief. It was space, a quiet kind of spaciousness I had built with care, with boundaries, with truth I no longer apologized for. And inside that space, I had grown into a version of myself I once didn't think was possible, a woman who didn't flinch when left out, who no longer twisted herself to be small enough to fit at someone else's table. The mentorship circle evolved into something larger, a retreat, a podcast, an online archive of anonymous stories shared by women from different cities, industries, and families. Some were teachers, some were executives, some were stay-at-home mothers who'd lost themselves in decades of emotional service with no acknowledgement in return. Their voices became the real chorus of my work. I was no longer the story, I was the bridge, and I liked it that way. In one episode, I told a short story I hadn't shared before about a Thanksgiving when I was 13, when I accidentally dropped a bowl of stuffing, and my uncle laughed so hard he nearly choked. "That's Kate," he said, "always messing up something." I hadn't cried then, but I didn't eat the rest of the night either. I just sat there, invisible, as the joke replayed again and again. When I finished telling that story on air, I added one line. Sometimes the stories that shaped you were never big enough to hold who you really are. The message inbox flooded with responses. One woman said, "You described a version of my childhood I never had the words for." Another said, "I thought I was weak for remembering the small humiliations. You just reminded me they were never small." That's what I had learned. Healing wasn't always about forgiveness. Sometimes it was about honoring the wound by naming it out loud. Elise visited me in late October. We had coffee on my balcony, the city rustling gently beneath us. She didn't bring up the family right away. She talked about work, her daughter's art class, a new recipe she tried. But as the sky dimmed, she finally said, "Mom keeps asking if you'll come for Christmas." I sipped my tea and looked straight ahead. "No," I said, "not because I'm angry, just because I don't belong to that version of us anymore." She didn't argue. She didn't beg. She just nodded. "I get it." She said, "For what it's worth, I think you're the only one who ever told the truth." I lost an eyes. I placed a hand over hers. Then maybe that's the only thing that mattered. As December approached again, I felt nothing heavy, no dread, no ache, just a kind of calm certainty. I'd already written the final page of that story. Now, I was living the sequel. I still got invitations from the family neutral, perfunctory, but I didn't feel the need to respond. Not out of cruelty, just clarity. And sometimes, clarity is the most merciful thing you can offer people who refused to grow with you. One evening, I reread the letter I had once placed in that black box. I had saved a digital copy, not out of nostalgia, but record. I wanted to see if the words still felt true. They did. Every sentence, every pause. But what surprised me was that I didn't feel defined by them anymore. That letter had once been my truth, carved out of years of silence. Now, it was just a chapter I no longer had to reopen. I closed my laptop and walked to the window. The streetlights flickered on in a quiet rhythm. Somewhere across the city, people were gathering around dinner tables, raising glasses, exchanging small talk layered over years of unspoken resentment. And I didn't envy them, not even a little, because I knew what it had cost me to leave that performance behind. And I also knew it was the most honest decision I'd ever made. My story didn't end with a family reunion. It didn't end with a tearful apology or some grand reconciliation. It ended with a choice, a quiet, steady choice to stop trying to make people see me and start seeing myself, to stop performing for inclusion and start practicing integrity, to stop shrinking and start standing. And that ending, quiet as it may have been, gave me everything I needed. So now, when people ask, what happened with your family? I say, nothing. And I mean it, because sometimes nothing is the loudest truth of all. The space they left, the silence they kept, the apology that never came, that nothing taught me how to build a life from scratch, a life rooted in dignity, not approval. And if you're someone still sitting at the edge of a family photo you were cropped out of, if you're still explaining why your absence doesn't mean failure, if you're still trying to be heard in a room designed to mute you, then maybe it's time to stop waiting. Not out of bitterness, but because you finally remembered who you are without their permission. So let me ask you, when you stop begging for a seat at their table, what might you finally make room for in your own life?